I remember the professor brought up a scenario. I had to speak at a conference, a journalism conference many years ago, and I gave the example that he gave me. He said, let's say that you come across an accident on a street corner and you stop as a reporter to take pictures for the newspaper, and somebody gets out of the wrecked car and comes running up to you and says, I didn't give you permission to take that picture. You can't use that picture without my permission. So do you use the picture or do you not use the picture? You have a guy saying that he's not going to give you permission to use it. So what do you think the class or the group of journalism students said when I gave them that scenario? You think that the guy took the picture or didn't take it? He took it. Yeah. Actually, remember, it's a street corner, right? It's not in somebody's house. It's a public place. And you have the right to be there. You have the right to be taking pictures. It's part of our society. We have a free society. The amazing thing was that the students, and these were all journalism students from high school, had never been told that. When I gave them that scenario, they all assumed that they had to get permission from the guy to use the picture. But you don't. And those are things you should think about too. Now that's not saying that journalists are not caring people and they're not, they're just going to do whatever they want to do. I began working in radio a long time ago at a radio station called KTRM, and this was in Beaumont. And this was a long time ago, in '73. And there was an incident in Huntsville. A group of inmates took the librarians hostage. They were on death row, so they had nothing to lose. So they took the librarians hostage, and they were holed up in the library in Huntsville. And I was at KTRM in Beaumont. One of the librarians was from Beaumont, and this was like 10 o'clock at night or something, and I was at the radio station. This lady calls, and she identified herself, and and she expected me to know who she was. She said something real strange though. She said, Huntsville, the officials in Huntsville stopped calling us a little while ago. And they're not returning our phone calls. We think that there's something going on in Huntsville. Have you or the radio station heard anything about what's happening in Huntsville? And I said, and I thought, who is this lady? But anyway, I said, listen to the radio station. If anything happens, we'll put it on. And we're usually the first. And we had a reporter in Huntsville covering the story. I was at the station. I was supposed to get the feed from him to put on the radio when something happened. But we also had machines, and you still have machines. They're Associated Press, UPI. They're like machines that spit out all this news continuously. But when you have a major news story, it's like they would stop. They run all the time, and newsrooms used to be really loud. But whenever something major would happen, they would all go silent, and that was to get your attention. It's like something major is coming over the wire. And then the next thing you'll see is when they start spitting out the major event that's happened, they even send like all this paper with big X's across it saying, watch carefully, something big is that you need to put out on the radio or on television. So I was talking to her, and she says, I said that like, if anything comes across a wire, or if our guy calls us from Huntsville, we'll put it on the radio as soon as we can. And I hung up, and just as I was talking to her, the teletype it stopped. Everything in the newsroom went dead. So like, I'm aware that something major is happening. And I hung up, and then when I hung up too, it dawned on me who the lady was that I was talking to. She was the sister of one of the hostages in Huntsville, and she was calling me to find out if I had heard anything about the fate of her sister. So I looked down at the teletype machine, and the next thing I see is news that her sister was dead. The inmates had tried to go down a ramp, and they surrounded the hostages with these boards. They were actually chalkboards, and they were going to try to make their way to a vehicle to get away, and they hit them with a water hose or something, like a fire hose, to knock them all over. But the hostages were killed, 3 of the librarians, and one of them was her sister. The lady that I just talked to obviously doesn't know her sister's dead, but I do. do I put it on the radio and tell her and the rest of the world that her sister's dead? So what would you have done? What do you think I did?
Call the sister.
Well, I didn't have her sister's phone number. I couldn't really call her back.
You could just say the person that just call back.
Well, it's really awkward because I'm an employee of the radio station. There were 19 radio stations back then in Beaumont, and we're all in competition with each other, right? And we were back then usually the news source for most of Beaumont. But I didn't really feel comfortable telling her sister was dead because I felt like the news should come in in an easier manner. And so, believe it or not, even though we had won, and that year we actually won the Associated Press Award for our coverage of the Huntsville shootout, but ironically, we were the only station that didn't report whenever the actual shooting occurred because I withheld the news. Because, like I said, I didn't really feel comfortable her finding out her sister was dead through some announcer on the radio. I didn't, I wondered if I'd get fired over but personally, I thought it was a very, it would have been an immoral thing for me to do to put the news out to her sister like that. So I tell you that story because you need to realize that even though journalists are very, very competitive with each other, I mean, they're not heartless either. The First Amendment is a very important thing. If you look at the school newspaper, I did an editorial on it. Is because I'm constantly seeing people tell me, even student publications, y'all are going to be doing stuff for the newspaper. You're going to be taking public pictures out there. And I still have administrators, teachers come up to me and say, how can you get away with using students' photos without, for the permission of their parents? If you take a photo in this hall out here, is it a private place or a public place?
Public.
It is a public hallway. The Supreme Court has upheld that. So you don't really have to have anybody's permission to use their photo. Now, with that said, I always tell staff members like Eagle Vision people and Wingspan photographers, don't use anybody's picture that doesn't want to be in the newspaper. Well, we do it as a courtesy, okay? We have the legal right to be able to do it. And so y'all should be aware of that, and that's a very important issue. I was at a meeting, if you read the editorial, I was at a meeting. It was a City of Houston meeting, and there was a government official in the meeting. And there was about to be a story, a negative story about him in the newspaper, and I was supposed to take his picture. So I raised my camera, and here you are at this meeting with all these people here in the government meeting, and the guy stops the meeting and points at me, and he says, "Don't you take my picture. If you do, I'm going to sue you." So what did I do? I took his picture. And actually, I made a point of taking his picture in front of everybody because I have a constitutional right to take his picture at a public meeting. And see, you should be, the First Amendment is something you should be very protective of. We're a free society because we have the First Amendment. Can you imagine if we didn't? The government could do what they want, and and they would keep the people in the dark about everything that they're doing. So that's something you should be aware of. Now, the last thing I would deal with is where all of this came from, the ideas. America has a free press. Most people don't understand what that involves. That means you don't have to get permission from somebody to start a newspaper. Anybody can start a newspaper. You don't have to get permission in advance for the things you put in your newspaper. But you are accountable for the things that are in your newspaper. If you make mistakes, if you defame somebody, and we'll talk about defamation, you can be sued and you can have to pay damages and things like that. But it all came from a guy named John Milton in England, centuries ago, who the British Parliament was considering censorship, and he wrote a piece called Areopagitica, and his famous quote that American journalism adopted was, and to paraphrase it roughly, is truth can never be bested by falsehood in the public arena.